thank you guys so much for being here. My name is Sarah. I am the program manager for the Growing Indigenous Storytellers Fellowship. And so I work at Journalists for Human Rights and just really pleased to be here on behalf of JHR. I'm currently an uninvited guest in Hatladiche First Nation territory, which is also known as sort of the southern bit of the Northwest Territories. So like I said, I'm pleased to be representing Journalists for Human Rights today, and I really want to recognize our partners in this program. So the Indigenous Journalists Association and APTN News. We have a bunch of people joining from APTN News today, so that's very exciting. Just to get some housekeeping out of the way right away, there's going to be about 30 minutes of presentation, 35 minutes. Then we're going to stop for a Q&A. For the Q&A, please either, if you would like me to read out your question to Duncan, then pop it in the chat. Otherwise, you could just raise your hand in the Q&A part and we'll go from there. This meeting is being recorded, including the Q&A, and will be posted to YouTube, so just be aware of that. And I think that's about it for my housekeeping. Yeah, excellent. So now I'm very pleased to introduce living legend Duncan McCue. He asked me to keep his bio very short, but I will say he is a longtime CBC radio host and TV news correspondent, and he is the author of Decolonizing Journalism, a guide to reporting in Indigenous communities, and The Shoe Boy, a memoir of his time spent on the trapline with the Cree family in northern Quebec. Duncan is a proud Anishinaabe from the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation in Southern Ontario. And with that, Duncan, I'll turn it over to you.
Miigwech, Sarah, miigwech. Ani Kenegwea, Onkwadans Indigenous Cas, Minwa Jagnashwal Nuswan Duncan McCue, Mainga Ned Dem, Chippewas Georgina Island Dunjiba, Anishinaabe and Dao, Woos and Dao, Wis and Dao. Meanwhile, department in there. Abjigo kitchen in them, I am on P. Abjigo kitchen in them, Bob Minagok. And for those of you who have your Anishinaabe one is Rusty, and I see James is way out there in BC, so of course he's thinking in a different language. I just said my name and my language, or my name and my clan and community that I'm from, and how happy I am to see you all here and to be asked to speak with you. And this is going to be super interesting because I actually see that there are non-journalists who are tuning in here. When JHR and the Indigenous Journalists Association approached me and said, "I'd like you to do a talk," I said, "I'd love to talk to the fellows." And I said, "What on?" And they said, "Decolonizing journalism. Do a talk on decolonizing journalism." I said, "Oh, okay. Well, that's a small topic for a half an hour talk." So I asked to find out what the fellows were interested in talking in and about, and so wanted to hear more about the textbook that I had written, Decolonizing Journalism. And so what I thought I'd do is I'm just going to address some of the questions that the fellows were interested in hearing about. And I know we've got a varied audience here. This is going to be very journalism specific, but I think that there are lessons here for anybody that works with Indigenous communities. And obviously we'll leave time at the end for questions. If you have things you want to fire at me that I don't address in this talk, happy to do so. But let me just really briefly tell you about where this textbook came from, why I wrote it, and what's in it. And then I'll get into the meat of my talk. This happened, I'm going to say in about 2007, 2008 or so. And I was working, as Sarah mentioned, I worked at CBC for 25 years. This was kind of midway through my career. And I was at yet another meeting of the CBC where they were wringing their hands, and senior journalists and producers were wringing their hands and saying, we need to improve the journalism about Indigenous communities on the CBC. How do we do that? And I can't tell you how many of those meetings that I went to, and we'd talk about important things, and then we would leave the meeting, and it seemed nothing ever changed. This was yet one more of those meetings, but out of that meeting, there was one thing that action item that came up. There was a discussion about how we need to help our non-Indigenous colleagues, and I'll say at that point, back in the mid 2000s, there weren't a lot of Indigenous journalists at the CBC. And the discussion came about how do we help our non-Indigenous colleagues do a better job of reporting in Indigenous communities, and the suggestion was they need some kind of toolkit. And I thought that made some sense. That made some sense, and giving some tips and advice on how they could change their reporting to do a better job. So I went away. It just so happened that not long after that meeting, I went on a fellowship to Stanford University, and my goal for that year when I was away was, aside from enjoying California, was to write a guide. And I ended up, because I was in the Silicon Valley, I ended up releasing that guide as a website, www.riic.ca, Reporting in Indigenous Communities. And I wrote this guide with working journalists in mind who are busy but want to improve their reporting, because that has been my experience of most of my colleagues in the newsrooms that I have worked in, is that they care desperately about their reporting. They want to make it better, but they don't have a lot of time. They certainly don't have resources to do that. And so I wrote this guide with that working journalist in mind, who had a half an hour at the end of the day and went, man, that story didn't go very well. How can I do it better? And the guide went up online, and as it turned out, there was lots of people who were very interested in improving their connections and their reporting in Indigenous communities. But I have to say that the biggest uptake was probably from journalism schools. Every year at the end of term, I would get a flood of emails from journalism profs and journalism students who were really working on projects in their classrooms and wanted to figure out how they could include Indigenous content in the classroom and in their storytelling projects. And so that's how it ended up turning into this textbook, which was published by Oxford University Press, and we kind of formalized it into more of an academic teaching guide. But the idea always was to try to help journalists, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, do this very difficult task of building relationships with communities so that they could tell better news stories. And that's really the essence of the book and what it's about. What the fellows asked me to talk about when they said, okay, talk about decolonizing journalism. I mean, that's a 300-page book, and I could go on for a full day and teach a whole course about decolonizing journalism. I've got a half an hour. So I'm going to talk about what the fellows asked me. And they asked me to tackle two things. Navigating the mainstream. So, as Indigenous journalists, how do we navigate the mainstream media, working in the mainstream media? And I did that for 25 years. Like I have some thoughts and on that. And this is an actual photo of me and my father whitewater canoeing. You can see that. I'm in the front enjoying when they asked me to talk about navigating working in the mainstream media, my thought immediately went to my dad and I. My dad used to take me out whitewater canoeing, and my journey through the CBC had lots of rapids, I will say. There were lots of places that I ran into rough waters, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And offer some tips and suggestions. And then the other thing the fellows wanted to know about was how to report on our communities in a good way. And so the second part of my talk, I'll talk a little bit about reporting indigenously. I'll call it that. But let me tackle the first part of what I set out to talk about here, and I'm going to offer any journalists who work in the mainstream. I know there are a lot of journalists here who are from APTN as well. Some of these tips may be less helpful for those working at APTN, but again, use them as you will. But particularly, I'm thinking about the Indigenous journalist who's working in a mainstream media outlet. Okay, and I've got three big tips for you. The first one is don't be tokenized. When I started at CBC 25 years ago, I was aware that I was the only Indigenous journalist in my newsroom. And 25 years ago, there were very few of us. And I didn't want to be the token Indian. I didn't want to be hired just because I was Indigenous and they needed to diversify their newsroom. And I made that very clear to my boss at the beginning. And she was an amazing woman. Sue Rideout supported me in all kinds of different ways. But upon arriving in the newsroom, there were many many ways in which my colleagues, either unwittingly or wittingly, were tokenizing me, and I only learned that the hard way. Um, I brought my story ideas to the newsroom, and often my story ideas had to do with the Indigenous community, with where I was getting my ideas from my friend circle, my colleagues, and the things that I watched and read. And so I would bring my Indigenous story ideas to the newsroom. Um, and that was fine. I felt passionate about reporting on Indigenous issues. It was one of the main reasons that I became a news reporter. So I wanted to have more Indigenous voices in the newsroom. But when I say to offer advice for those who are working in the mainstream, and particularly those who are starting out, um, you will be the minority. There's no doubt about that, that you're going to be one of few. Doesn't matter how big or small your newsroom is. And there are a couple of things that I would suggest you do not do. Perhaps the most a common thing that I see is non-Indigenous reporters coming to Indigenous reporters and asking for their sources. They are working on a story about XYZ Indigenous issue, and they need help connecting. They need help finding people. They need help finding Indigenous people, Indigenous experts, and whatever it may be. And they come to you and say, I'm doing this story on child welfare. I'm doing this story on residential schools. I'm doing this story on pipelines. Do you know someone? Do you have someone? I would urge you to not simply turn over your source book, your contact book, to non-Indigenous reporters. And I don't say that to be mean or not to be collegial, but your sources are the natural resource that you bring to the newsroom, if you will, right? Your sources are your bread and butter. That is how you are going to get your stories onto the air, is the relationships that you have with the Native community or with people that you go out and interview and have connected with and have continued on. And by simply turning over a cell number or an email address of your sources to another reporter, you're turning over your natural resource, your most valuable thing, which is your source book, and giving it to somebody else and saying, sure, go ahead and you make a great story out of the work that I did finding all these people, right? Or the other challenge with that is that you're not sure how that person may treat the source that you end up turning over to them. And that can be a really challenging situation when you have somebody who ends up inadvertently treating one of your sources badly. So I really urge you to protect your sources. And it's not rude to say, I wish I could help you out, but I'm not just going to turn over my source book. Another thing that happened to me when I was early on in my career was that I was asked to be the face of an Indigenous story. So a producer would do a piece on an Indigenous topic, but they knew that they should have an Indigenous reporter on that story. And so I was asked to do the voiceover work, for example, or to do a stand-up and really not have anything to do with the story, but simply to be the hair and the teeth, the Indigenous hair and teeth for a story. I did that twice. The second time it didn't work out so well, and I said, I'm not doing that anymore. if I'm going to be involved in this story, if my face is going to be the one, and again, I'm a broadcast a TV journalist, if I'm the one that is going to be the face of this story, I need to be involved from the get-go, right from the beginning, and involved in the deep reporting of this to understand the relationships, to understand the context, to help the shaping and the writing of the story. I need to be involved in a significant way. So that's what I mean when I say don't be tokenized. Don't let yourself be used to benefit someone else's work on Indigenous issues. And I don't mean that to be uncharitable to our colleagues that we're working side by side. You can help them in small ways, but make sure that it's ways that benefit your career. And it's particularly hard when you're starting out in a newsroom. And the reason that I agreed to do narration and voiceover for these two pieces was it was a chance for me to get on on the national network. And I thought, boy, I can't pass this up. But it wasn't I didn't have a hand in shaping those stories, and I realized quickly that that could hurt my credibility as an Indigenous journalist. So I urge you to stand up for yourself and not be tokenized if you go into a mainstream newsroom. Second suggestion that I have is when it comes to working in a mainstream newsroom is pitch better. I see a lot of young Indigenous journalists who come into the newsroom and get frustrated when their pitches are ignored or aren't listened to or just kind of swept aside. And that frustration begins to build the more and more that happens. When you come in and have all kinds of great story ideas about what you would like to see in your news outlet, in the paper or on the airwaves, and the senior producer just goes, no, that's not a story, or oh no, we don't have room for that today. Go work on something else. The solution to that is not getting frustrated and PO'd and upset with the senior producer who just doesn't understand you. The solution to that is figuring out how to pitch better. Sometimes the reason that those decisions are made is because that senior producer, that assignment editor, has been around a long time, has seen a lot of news stories go by over the years, and has a deep understanding of the stories that work and the stories that don't. And what helps in terms of getting your story idea on the air is understanding how to fit your story idea into the pitch model of this particular outlet. And so what I discovered was that walking in and saying, I'd really like to do something on child welfare, was not a great pitch. Walking in and saying, yeah, there was this native hockey tournament going on this weekend. I'd really like to do something on native hockey. Not a great pitch. That is a subject, and it's both of those are important subjects, and they could have great stories in them, but they're half-baked story ideas. They don't have characters. They don't have a focus. They don't have any research to go along with them. And so what I discovered was that takes time to put together a proper story pitch. And so what I would do is I would work on the stories that I really cared about after hours. I would fully develop because I don't have time. If you're a daily news reporter, you rarely have time to actually work on pitches. But early on in my career, I realized that I needed to fully develop a pitch if someone was going to accept it. If I brought real characters who had already researched and found and who were willing to be part of my story, that was half the battle. But I needed to kind of do some of that work after hours, if you will, work those and develop the pitch. And so I would keep these pitches in my back pocket and work on them so that when I did get the opportunity, finally, someone said, oh, yeah, Oolikans, we need a story on Oolikans. I would have this story that was already, prepared as a pitch, and then I could go out and I knew I could knock it out of the park rather than starting from scratch or just coming in with an idea and not a fully formed story pitch. So again, I emphasize to people pitch better and understand how to pitch to your news organization, and that will lead to your story ideas being accepted. Once you get to have a relationship with someone, your assignment editor or senior producer, and they see that you can knock a couple stories out of the park, then you can start to take advantage of that relationship, and you don't need to put in as much work because they'll trust you. They'll trust you at that point and say, I don't really know what it is that McCue wants to do about Native hockey, but I know that he can pull this off, so I'll let him go out and do the story. But that comes with years of experience, and early on, it helps to fully develop your pitches. The last piece of advice I have for people who are trying to navigate the mainstream is find your allies. And this advice came from a very wise trainer at the Poynter Institute, Jill Geisler, when I was on that fellowship at Stanford. And I have to say, people don't go on fellowships because, they're thrilled with their working environment. They go on fellowships because they need something new. They're tired, they need something new, they need fresh ideas, they need a break from the newsroom, whatever it may be. And I needed a break from the CBC, which is why I applied to go on the fellowship in the first place. And I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to go back to work. I was like, and Jill had a session with us as we were about to return from our fellowship, and she said, "What are the goals that you want to accomplish when you go back to the newsroom?" And I had all these grand goals about, in more Indigenous storytelling, setting up a CBC Indigenous website, all kinds of things that had been talked about for years and years, doing this guide, for example, but weren't happening at the CBC. And I said, there's nobody there that cares about these issues. And she said, who are your allies that are going to help you get these things that you care about done in the newsrooms at CBC? And I said, I don't have any. I don't have any allies. And I almost started to weep. Because I didn't want to go back, and I didn't know how to get these things done that I cared about so deeply. And Jill was so kind because she took me aside and we sat down and we started to talk. And it wasn't what she began to pull out of me was that no, there weren't people who understood what I was talking about when I wanted to put together a toolkit for non-Indigenous journalists, or who necessarily supported the idea of having a CBC digital platform, again, which turned into CBC Indigenous eventually, things like that. They may not have bought those ideas because that came with resources and they didn't really understand the impact and all kinds of different things. But what she did help me understand were there were people that I worked with in my newsroom who cared about me, who cared about the work that I did and wanted to see me succeed. They helped me in various different ways. They may not have necessarily supported these specific ideas, but they cared about me. And as I sat down and thought about it, there were a number of people who had supported me throughout my career at the CBC in various different ways. And Jill's advice was, you've got to leverage those people. You've got to leverage those allies to get to your goals of what you want to accomplish. And they may not be the people who will help you publish this reporting guide or set up the digital website or anything like that, but they can connect you to the people who will. And you've got to find your allies and leverage them, because they're the ones that are going to help you advance the things that you want to accomplish within that organization. And sure enough, when I went back to the CBC, I made a point of checking back in with those handful of people who I had identified as allies. And I said, this may sound crazy, but these are the things that I want to do. I don't need to do them like today, but these are long-term goals for me. And with the help of those allies, I was able to connect to people that I didn't even know in the organization. And again, this was a big organization, the CBC. And slowly but surely, those goals began to get accomplished. So don't be like me and say, oh, no, I don't have any allies. I'm alone in this battle. Because there's somebody. You didn't get hired unless there's somebody there who thinks that you're doing a good job and is worth keeping around. And people want to keep you around. Trust me. Hiring people, I'm doing a bunch of hiring right now, and hiring people is tough. It is difficult to hire. And so there are people that want you to stay. Find those people and figure out how you can accomplish the things that you want by finding your allies. So those are my 3 tips for navigating mainstream newsrooms. Don't be tokenized, pitch better, and find your allies. And I'm happy to talk more about any of those things if you want. The second part of what the fellows had asked about was um, kind of how to report in a good way when it comes to our communities. And I bring the textbook back up again because one of the things that I did in the textbook that I didn't do in the online guide was I sat down with other Indigenous journalists and talked about how they worked. And that to me was one of the richest parts of putting together this textbook. I got to talk with nine Indigenous journalists who frankly are friends, and that's I reached out and said I'd like to have this conversation with you. But Tanya Talaga and Connie Walker and Tim Fontaine and Tristan Atone and I'm going to forget people here. Mark Trahant. There are others. I'm going to forget all their names. They all sat down and talked about how they do their work, their daily work of being a journalist, and I learned so much from them. And what I discovered was that, I mean, when I talk about decolonizing journalism, what I'm really talking about is the way that we as Indigenous journalists are changing, I argue, changing the way that journalism is done. And so let me share what I mean by reporting indigenously, just through the eyes of some of my friends and some of the best journalists in the business who I think are just doing incredible work. As Indigenous journalists, I think one of the big ways that we're really changing the business is doing trauma-informed work. And I can't think of anyone better to speak on that than my friend Connie Walker. Of course, you all know Pulitzer Prize winning, podcast stolen, et cetera, now hired at TMU. And Connie told me this in the textbook. She said, I don't want to leave people in a worse situation. When you're dealing with Indigenous communities, trauma is interwoven into so many aspects of life. You have to be careful and respectful of how that impacts people. Connie and I will say other female Indigenous journalists in particular, have really, really started to change the way that we think about interviewing our people when it comes to either traumatic events that they've lived through or historical trauma, and making sure that we're there before, during, and after an interview for those people, that we don't just think of them as gets, yeah, we got that, and we put the clip on the air as they're weeping and so, but really thinking about the impact that it has when we ask someone, how does it feel? And thinking about the impact afterwards. And I think that's one major way that Indigenous journalists, because of the way that of our upbringing and our experience, frankly, of trauma for many of us, we're doing a much better job of being trauma informed when it comes to our journalism practice. Another thing that I think Indigenous journalists are doing innately is practicing harm reduction. And my friend Tanya Talaga, Seven Fallen Feathers, so many other great podcasts and documentaries as well, talked a lot about harm reduction. And of course, it's part of journalism practice to minimize harm. But I would argue that Indigenous journalists are raising the bar on that and saying we have to practice harm reduction. And Tanya had this to say. She said, that family, that person has let you into their life. You are part of their story now, too, because you've told their most intimate, most tragic details, and you shared them with the world. You're part of it now. You're not a casual observer. And I think that's something that Indigenous journalists are doing, is we're building relationships with our sources in ways that perhaps some non-Indigenous journalists are uncomfortable with. Some might suggest that there's a tension there between bias. I would argue that from an Indigenous perspective, it's about relationship building and making sure that we're reducing harm. Harm may happen. When we put a story out into the world, we can't erase harm, but we can do our utmost to reduce harm. And I think that's something that Indigenous journalists are doing on the regular. Another thing that occurs to me about the way that we're practicing is humility. And of course, when my friend Wabgijig Rice, who's a former reporter, now famous best-selling publishing author, Moon of the Crusted Snow, Moon of the Turning Leaves. Get his books. But when he talked about humility, I connected with that as Anishinaabe. It is one of our seven grandfather teachings to be humble, to be humility. It's something I ask for every time I go into the lodge, believe me. Um, but what Wob had to say is we're trying to expose truths and make people aware for the greater good. But you have an industry of lone wolves who want to be heroes, who are in it mostly for themselves. They want to acquire stories for that reason. There's no humility there at all. And I got to say, early on in my career, I got sucked into that. I Of course you have to have some ego if you're going to be a journalist. You have to. If you're going to put your byline there, if you're going to put your face on the television, if your voice is going to go out over the airwaves, you have to have a healthy amount of ego. You have to believe that you have a story that is worth telling to the rest of the world. But that doesn't mean that you stop being humble, that you think about that you center yourself. We need to make sure that as journalists, we are part of the circle. And that means going in and being humble about what we do and why we're doing it. And that really rung true. You don't hear many people in the newsrooms talking about humility. That's not a common word in a newsroom, but I do think it's a value that many Indigenous journalists are bringing to their work. This is all super serious, and so let's just have a quick break for some headlines. Hundreds of wispy-whiskered Indigenous men pull out of Movember, calling it unworkable. And then another headline, Canada present full-grown Indigenous men to royal couple as engagement. These are headlines that are ripped from Walking Eagle, which is the finest source of Indigenous news anywhere in Turtle Island, I will say right now. Of course, you know that those are satirical headlines. Humor is another thing that Indigenous people are bringing to our news reportage. And I can't think of anyone better to talk about that than Tim Fontaine, the editor, grandest editor in chief, I think is what he calls himself at Walking Eagle. Our humor, the things we laugh at, are making news now. It shows we're a very diverse group of people, and also that we're humans. We laugh. There's joy in our communities. I don't need to belabor this one for you guys. I know that you know this. The stoic Indian, the sad, crying Indian, the pitiful, tragical Indian. Oh my God, we've seen that over, and the angry Indian bird, Oka. That's what we've seen over and over and over again in news coverage. And I think Indigenous journalists are expanding that notion of what it is to be Indigenous in the news. And it doesn't mean that it needs to be, Jon Stewart, everything's funny, or even Walking Eagle news. Funny is hard. Funny is really hard. And news reporters shouldn't necessarily try to be a gag fest. But it is okay to have people smiling. It is okay to do news stories about beaded baby Yoda on Instagram and all kinds of other things. And I'll keep that point simple. And then the last thing I want to wrap up on, and just in terms of quote decolonizing journalism and how us as Indigenous journalists are doing that is talk about accountability. I think you see a high level of accountability to the communities that we report on amongst Indigenous journalists because we're part of those communities. We bump into them at the gas station. We see them at the bingo. We see them at the next conference. We can't just do stories and then go off into disappear back into the city again. And Tristan Atone said this, my friend from south of the medicine line. You see people again in Indian country. This is the difference in terms of ethics we employ as reporters. We don't have the opportunity to go in, screw it up, and then never see that person again. And I think that level of accountability that we practice as Indigenous journalists really raises the bar. Because we know that we're going to have to go back. You're going to get that Facebook message from the aunties. You're going to, all those kinds of things. And that doesn't mean that we need to be scared. We need to be confident in our journalism. But we are a part of the community, and we're not just out. We can't just fade away. And that really, I think, raises the bar in terms of accountability. So I wanted to try to keep it to time. Sarah said she wanted to leave it open for questions, so I'll stop there. I've got one quick plug though, Sarah. Let's have some
By all
questions.
means,
Yeah,
please.
I've got a quick plug after we're done.
Okay,
I'll stop sharing and then share again when we're done our Q&A.
perfect. Thank you. All right, and thank you so much. That was a lot of information to convey. Like that was a lot of topic, um, and just really impressed with how you were able to put some of it into that amount of like the short amount of time that we have. So again, for Q&A, if you want me to ask your question, please feel free to drop it in the chat, or if you want to just raise your hand. A reminder to those that joined a little bit later, this part will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube with the rest of the presentation. So just be aware of that. Okay, anyone have any questions? Anybody? Perhaps somebody at APTN. I know there's a lot of you in that room.
Yes, yes, sir. Here is Krisa Najkute.
Perfect, thank you.
Hey, Duncan.
Ani Creason.
Good to have you here. Thanks for taking some time to chatting with us. Um, Great presentation. I've been trying to look for your book. I haven't found it yet, but when I do, I will pick it up.
Good Minds.
Go ahead.
If you look on Good Minds, support Indigenous booksellers. That's the place to.
Right on. I guess just a side note, this is what I'm wondering about. Do you miss being on CBC National?
Of course, man. Of course. I mean, I didn't leave CBC because I was fed up with CBC or that I was tired of journalism. I left because I believe in encouraging the next generation of Indigenous journalists, and that's actually what I want to talk about. I'll bring the screen back up. We're setting up a certificate of in journalism in Indigenous communities at Carleton University, where I now teach. And that's what I'll talk about after we're done the Q&A. But of course I miss it. I mean, storytelling, it is such a privilege, and it is such a joy. And you know, Creason, I mean, when you dig into the story and you get to know somebody and they share things that just make amazing television, there is no better feeling. And so I do still, fortunately, as a journalism prof, I still get to practice journalism, and I'm still on the radio airwaves from time to time when I'm needed. So I scratch my itch that way.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone else with a question?
We have another one from the floor here.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm Bruce Spence.
Honey, Bruce.
I'm just wondering, like, decolonizing, sovereignty, self-determination. How come the journalists that I see these days do not ask the questions like, what is sovereignty? What is the role of the matriarchy in sovereignty and title to our country? And why would I have to go to the anthropology department to find the answers to those questions? They don't teach it in the Native Studies courses that I've seen or participated in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so would you say that for reporters on APTN as well, Bruce?
Yes, he walked away with the mic, but he's nodding affirmatively.
Yeah, I mean, I've always maintained that Indigenous journalists are well placed to tell those stories, and I'll use the example of the Wet'suwet'en pipelines. Like there was a great when you know, the country was being shut down by that direct action. What really needed to happen deeply was somebody to help people understand the feast system amongst the Giksan Wet'suwet'en, the hereditary chief system, alternative forms of government. And that's difficult territory for any journalists, whether indigenous or non-indigenous. But those are the kinds of that's the kind of work that really needs to be done, and I would argue by our people. If whether it's the Longhouse or other non-Indian Act banned governments that are that our First Nations have in this country, they need to be explained and explored, and frankly held accountable as well. Those systems are not without problems, uh, and it's Indigenous journalists that should be asking those difficult questions about whether those systems are working correctly. And so I agree with you, Bruce. I mean, I think we need to have way more explanations, and journalists are well equipped to do that.
Definitely. Okay. Maybe time for one more question. Cheryl, do you have anybody else?
Yes, we do.
Excellent.
We have a reporter, T.R. Wheatley.
Hey Duncan,
Hey, my friend TR.
TR Wheatley here. Um, I left CBC because I was sick of their ish. Um, but maybe you can give some people advice on how sometimes it is hard there being the only Indigenous person and going against those people all the time. I think that
And
would be helpful because on the one hand, CBC was really good in preparing me technically, but when it comes to the Indigenous stuff, some of them are rude.
and TR, I mean, I will say this publicly, what I hope I've shared with you privately, which is that TR did, and I'll just let everyone know, TR did some amazing work on our MMIW database, which I was a small part of. And, I think we at CBC, I would hope, learn some lessons about the way to do that difficult work from that project. But I don't think that we fully when I talk about trauma informed, and the approach that Connie Walker and others are now employing. I think that project that TR worked on was a real eye opener for me on ways that we were not trauma informed in terms of the approach that we were taking for our staff. The incredibly heavy lifting that we asked TR and others to do, without taking care of them. And all I can say is that I would hope that we're doing better, and if we're not, we need to start doing better. But it certainly opened my eyes to the way that we were. When I talk about being tokenized, um, that's an example of asking, production assistants and other people on staff to do incredibly difficult emotional work without supporting them and without celebrating them.
Definitely. Thank you, Duncan, for that answer.
Yeah,
Sorry.
sorry, Sarah. There was just a follow from TR. If you
Please, yeah.
have, Duncan, if you have advice on if somebody wanted to stay in that situation.
Yeah, so and I think again, it can get this is why I say find your allies, because you can get militant about it and go to the union and go that route, and some people do. Um, but that to me, you know, if you're at that level of antagonism at a workplace already where you're having to go to the union to fight the battles, then I raise questions about whether that's the kind of workplace that you want to be in. And I don't absolutely I understand economic necessity and people got to pay the bills and you got a paying job and what do you go to? I understand that. But in my career, I have often tried to prioritize my own work-life balance and happiness. And if I'm unhappy at work, then things start to go sideways in my personal life as well. And which is why I don't really, yes, it's difficult if you got to pay the rent and put food on the table. And believe me, I struggled with that for years. I raised two young kids and but I guess if you want to stay, this is why I go back to that tip of finding your allies. There's got to be someone there who wants and can help uh, build those relationships that you need to be able to work happily. Let me do my plug here.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm gonna share my screen for a second. Oh geez, now you're seeing now you're seeing that I'm a Leaf fan. Sorry,
I was
Winnipeg.
gonna say it's the
Winnipeg Jets people are just like, oh no, yeah, the cup's gonna come. No way, man, it's going down Bloor Street. Give me 2 seconds here. Okay.
Yep, there we
Uh,
go.
so okay. So I talked about this certificate that we are launching at Carleton University. I've been teaching for about 15 years at various journalism schools, UBC, TMU, now at Carleton. And I think something that all journalism schools right across the country are struggling with is trying to get Indigenous students into J schools. And we know that is such an important step into getting into the newsrooms in the first place. So we're launching a certificate in journalism in Indigenous communities at Carleton, and it's a one-year certificate that is designed so that students can stay in their home communities. It's a hybrid program. Most of it will be online, but we'll be gathering for in-person intensives. The reason I want to talk about this right now is that we just posted today that we are hiring 7 contract instructors for that program, which launches on September of 2025. So this upcoming September. So I know I got a bunch of APTN journalists who are looking at me right now. We're hiring 7 Indigenous journalists, the experienced Indigenous. We want to offer the most experienced Indigenous journalists that we can to these students. And like I said, there's 4 courses that are online, 2 that are intensive, in-person intensives. So check us out, CJIC on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, because we just put up the job posting for the 7 instructors right now, and you can see all the information and hit me up on the socials or send me an email if you're interested in being an instructor. Okay, there you go. That's my pitch.
Excellent. Nothing like an action item at the end. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you for bearing with us as we went a little bit over time. Duncan, thank you so much for agreeing to come and do this presentation. If anybody has any feedback, please feel free to send it to canadian.programs@jhr.ca. And otherwise, please stay tuned on social media, both IJA and JHR social media, for future entries in this series. We very much look forward to seeing you again.
Miigwech Kunigwaya.
Thank you.